There's no question that John McCain is the candidate, the preferred candidate of the war industry. He's going to be great for business. But let's be clear here. For the first time in 15 years, the defense industry is giving more money to the Democrats than the Republicans, after an all-time low of 36% in the early 1990s. It's because they're testing which way the winds are blowing, and they know that at the end of the day, the Republicans and Democrats are on the same team, and so it fluctuates depending on who they think is going to have more power. The Republicans could run a head of lettuce for president, and the head of lettuce would be the candidate of the war industry and the establishment and the corporations. They would talk about head of lettuce as a patriot, head of lettuce is going to keep us safe, head of lettuce is going to be the one for us, and they figure out a way to spin it as a green revolution too at the same time. And they managed to find a candidate who is slightly less charismatic than a head of lettuce. And on the flip side, you have Barack Obama. Now, to his credit, Barack Obama was ahead of almost everyone else in the Senate in understanding this issue. And I've been very critical of the legislation that he introduced because I think it plays into the hands of the industry and ultimately is pro-industry legislation. But Obama spoke out about this 8 months before Nicer Square. He called them unaccountable, above the law, and he also said that they were a danger to U.S. troops because of blowback on U.S. troops from their misconduct. Now, there's no point in getting into the problems with Obama's legislation right now. We can maybe talk about that later. But the fact is that Obama understands this issue. I don't agree with his position on it, but I know that he understands it. But Barack Obama is going to be a president, if he wins, who is going to bring more business to these companies, because Obama does not have a plan to end the occupation of Iraq. He has a plan to downsize it a bit and rename it and repackage it and represent it to the world. But the fact of the matter is that Obama's plan is based largely on the Iraq Supplemental Spending Bill of 2007, which was portrayed as the Democrats' withdrawal plan, and the findings of the Iraq Study Group. In fact, he recently brought on Lee Hamilton as one of his advisors. And Obama's Iraq plan would leave 20 to 80,000 U.S. troops in Iraq after he's done with his withdrawal plan. He's going to keep in place the major outposts of the occupation that bring money to the contractors. The Green Zone, the monstrous U.S. Embassy, which was built in large part on slave labor, the largest embassy of any nation in world history, as well as maintain control of the Baghdad airport and other facilities around Iraq. And he says he intends to keep in place what he calls a strike force to strike at Al-Qaeda. Once again, using the propaganda language of the Bush administration, strike at Al-Qaeda. And so the fact of the matter is that these companies are going to be safe, whether it's Obama or whether it's John McCain in office. And it's not just about Iraq. It also is about all of Obama's foreign policy, the main flashpoints of U.S. foreign policy. What happened recently within the Obama campaign is that he pushed aside many of the more quote-unquote progressive foreign policy people and brought in the old guard. He brought in Madeleine Albright, Warren Christopher, Lee Hamilton. He's got Tony Lake, Susan Rice. The list goes on and on. It's like a who's who of the belligerent foreign policies of the Clinton administration. And that's why I said at the beginning, it's not about the man or the woman running for office. It's ultimately about who they surround themselves with and what are their policies. You know, people go into these stadiums and they just clap and talk about how charismatic, and yet change is good. But when Barack Obama says, I was against the war in 2002 and I'm going to end it in 2009, he is overtly misleading his supporters. He has no intention, none whatsoever, of ending the occupation in 2009, and I don't even think that he has an intention to end the occupation by the end of a first term. He believes in U.S. imperial interests in Iraq. That is abundantly clear from his plan and the people he has chosen to shape his Iraq policy. And it's not just Iraq. He's going to send 7,000 more troops into Afghanistan right away, and he's been ratcheting up his rhetoric on Latin America, adopting the so-called war on drugs mindset to the counterinsurgency war in Latin America. There are two major initiatives that Blackwater has recently undertaken that ultimately are going to thrive under Barack Obama if he wins. The first is that Blackwater recently started its own private CIA called Total Intelligence Solutions. It's based out of the Ballston complex in Arlington, Virginia. They have somewhere between 70 and 100 people working out of that facility. They built it up based on the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, and they are marketing what they call CIA-type services to Fortune 500 corporations and governments. It's being run by 3 veterans of the CIA, not from 20 years ago, but from the Bush administration. At the top of the pyramid is J. Cofer Black. 28 years in the CIA, the man who ran the CIA's extraordinary rendition program, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program. This was the guy who told the U.S. Congress that there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. His nickname in the Bush administration was the flies on the eyeball guy, because he would constantly talk about how when we're through with our enemies, they're going to have flies crawling across their eyeballs. The number 2 person, Robert Richer, former deputy director of operations at the CIA, and number 3, Enrique Rick Prado, 24 years in the CIA, 10 with the CIA paramilitary division, specialist in Latin America. Those men, with their intimate knowledge of U.S. national intelligence, with their network of contacts around the world, with their entire history and their career, they are now on the open market for bidding by for-profit corporations, the U.S. government, and other governments. They recently were hired by King Abdullah of Jordan, for instance. They are working for other corporations as well. Blackwater enters a very profitable and expanding industry. 70% of the combined intelligence budget of the 16 U.S. intelligence agencies, 70% of that budget is now being outsourced to private contractors. They are involved with every level of the gathering, production, and presentation of intelligence on a daily basis in this country. 70%. I met a guy the other day who worked for Lockheed Martin doing intelligence. He said he tried to get a job at the CIA, and the CIA told him to go to a private company because you'll end up working with us anyway, but you'll make much more working for the private company. And so even if I was a traditional conservative, this would drive me crazy in this country right now, because you're talking about companies whose bottom line is their profits, and period, that are now involved with the U.S. intelligence apparatus, but they're also putting these services on the open market. The second program of Blackwater is that they are right now bidding for a share of a $15 billion contract with the U.S. Department of Defense to, quote, fight terrorists with drug trade ties, the so-called war on drugs. I researched this program, and it specifically targets Bolivia, Colombia, and countries in Central Asia, as well as Afghanistan. Blackwater already works for the Drug Enforcement Agency in Afghanistan. The Wall Street Journal said it could be Blackwater's biggest job ever. Look at the nation of Colombia right now. The U.S. gives $630 million a year to Bogota for the so-called war on drugs. And then they say to Uribe, you turn around and spend that money on U.S. war companies that will deploy inside of your borders. So Uribe spends almost half of the war on drugs money hiring for-profit U.S. war corporations to deploy inside of Colombia. Evo Morales of Bolivia recently welcomed DynCorp, the Walmart of private security companies inside of Bolivia. They're going after coca crops. This is Evo Morales, who stood in front of the UN with a coca leaf and said it's not a drug. He now has a U.S. mercenary company in his country. This is not a war on drugs. This is a counterinsurgency war. It's the same war that's been waged since 1954, when the CIA overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, brought down Allende, brought up Pinochet, death squads throughout Latin America, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, the Contras in Nicaragua, the overthrow of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the war against the Zapatistas in Chiapas, the war against Hugo Chavez right now and other leftist leaders in Latin America. It's a counterinsurgency war. It used to be a war on communism, then it was a war on drugs, now it's a war on terrorists with drug trade ties. But the point is, it's a backdoor military occupation by the United States using private companies. And so when we talk about Barack Obama, and we look at the major foreign policy issues of our time, of our moment, we look at Iraq. He has a plan to continue the occupation. We look at Afghanistan. He's going to escalate it by sending more troops. We look at Latin America. He's going to radically increase funding to the so-called war on drugs, which is a counterinsurgency war. His rhetoric recently has been ratcheted up against Iran, and he's brought in the old guard from the Clinton administration to serve as his senior foreign policy team. And so yes, this is not about just one person. This is about the team of people that he has. And this is old wine in a new bottle, is what we're looking at here. It's a redux of the Clinton administration's team, the people that brought us the genocidal sanctions against Iraq, the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam, and a war against the people in Latin America. And so as we talk about moving forward with this movement, and we talk about mobilizations, if we do not have as one of our centerpieces a direct confrontation of the very corporations that make these policies possible and stand to continue making a killing off of them, then we are missing the point. It's not just about demonstrating in Washington or at the White House or in front of the Congress. Ultimately, and this is a long-term campaign, ultimately it means going to the gates of these war corporations and bringing the resistance right up to where it counts to them, where they operate in those communities. Thank you very much for being here.